I was talking to my friend Matthew Dowd last week, who's as smart a guy as I've ever met when it comes to American politics. And he had a couple of observations about DeSantis. And one was basically, can you believe how bad he is at this? And it's shocking, right, as a national candidate who's kind of been, I think, falsely lifted on this kind of hot air of assumptions by the national media, absent any merit. But secondly, what he said was how disconnected the politics in Florida has become from national politics. Because if he's their guy, and apparently he might be, judging by the size of the landslide reelection, it just doesn't fly in the rest of America. And I wonder, when you look at the Democratic Party, there's something that's not talked about enough, in my view, 7 years on, since Trump came down the escalator. Trump is beating who exactly? Right? What is wrong with a party that it could conceivably lose to these people? What is it, when you honestly look at the Democratic Party? And I come at it from a perspective as a former Republican who was always a moderate in my politics, that both of these parties are extremely important institutions in the history of the country, in world history, for the advancement of human freedom and democracy. But what is it about the Democratic Party that it has become so estranged from so many Americans that this MAGA movement is seen as any type of alternative at all?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it goes back to something I really focus on in the book that you mentioned, the Saving Democracy book. I think on most of our core issues, we actually are in step with mainstream America. A middle-class based economics, public education, a woman's right to choose. But I think in many ways, the way we run doesn't highlight that. Normally, when the question is called on these issues, like in Kansas, we win. Or like in Ohio last week, we win. But one of my biggest sort of passions, if you hear me at all, is we got to run everywhere. Because if we don't run everywhere, we're not communicating what we're for. We're letting them communicate who we are without us actually fighting back. And so what's happening? When I say we're not running everywhere, that we're not even making an effort everywhere, it's 50% of the Tennessee Republicans who voted out those two justices, no opponent the prior November. 50% of them, basically. Oklahoma, it's above 60. Texas and most states, it's in the 30 or 40%. And when we're not in the fight in these areas, and we're not holding extremism accountable, and their extremism is a loser. We are seeing it lose all over. We saw it lose with every election denying Secretary of State candidate in a swing state last November. They lost everywhere. We see it lose again when it's exposed. And they're bringing it out more and more, the DeSantis and Trump primary. But if we're not in the fight, exposing it for what it is and then saying what we're for, they're winning. And they're not only winning, they're defining the terms. So I'll say it in this way. I see so many people, taking credit for the good things that the Biden and Democratic bills did around infrastructure and chips in all these red states. In Ohio, the lieutenant governor runs around Ohio and he takes credit for all of it. And if you're not running it everywhere, you're not even there to raise your hand and say, oh, actually, you had nothing to do with this. That was our side doing it. We're the ones that lifted the middle class. We're the ones that invested in infrastructure. And so what do? When we're not running, they blame us for problems. They mischaracterize why those problems happen. The reason that rural schools are suffering in a lot of states isn't because of some caravan from Mexico. It's because the state houses voted to decrease funding for those schools. But if you're not running everywhere, they get to blame it on the people that aren't even in the game, and then we also aren't taking credit for what we're doing. So I think that on core issues, Like, and go back to, and you, I assume, agreed with me that Joe Biden's State of the Union was a masterful speech. Almost everything he talked about, whether it's economics or Social Security, whatever, was very popular. And it was a good speech. The reason they shouted him down was they didn't want people to hear about unpopular positions they have. But when you're not running everywhere, you're not able to give that communication where it needs to be heard, and you end up getting turned upside down all over. So I think that core messaging and core positions are actually quite strong, but we're not executing in a way that we're having most people in all the places you're talking about hear our message. And so I think there's a lot of work to do, and this is what I go through this book. Build an infrastructure that values running everywhere, that says we want you stepping up to run, even in tough places. We celebrate you as a patriot when you do that. And then when you're in those places, message on the things that they are doing badly in those places, that all over states like Ohio that are corrupt. You mentioned the corruption. We have massive corruption in Ohio. The biggest bribery scandal in history. This former speaker went to jail a month ago or 2 months ago. And every time you see a corrupt state, you see terrible outcomes. Ohio public schools were ranked 5th in the nation 14 years ago. Now we're in the mid-20s. That you see small towns collapsing, again, not because of caravans from Mexico, because of their policies and state houses not working. Run everywhere and then explain to them the reason these things are happening is because of their policies, and we're going to do better. And that's how you have someone like the new Laura Kelly, the second-term Democratic governor of Kansas. She ran on issues like that and won. So I think it all starts with a different mindset. Be a national party. Run everywhere. Hold extremists accountable everywhere, and run hard on issues that frustrate everyday people that often are not doing well because of the policies coming out of these rigged state houses.
Do you view the extremism and the corruption as deeply linked?
Absolutely. It's all this. It's all once you have I have these little sort of charts I go through in my book. Basically, they're the two interests who love gerrymandered state houses are the extremists, national, not just in-state, national extremists who know that their worldview would lose every time in a fair democracy. They know Kansas would be their future forever, or Ohio this last week. If you have a straight-up vote on abortion bans, no exceptions, that send rape victims to other states, they will lose every time they do it. So they want a gerrymandered state house. But who also wants a gerrymandered state house? The special interests. Because often, what do these special interests want? They want a piece of the public pie. When they get the public pie, public outcomes disintegrate. Take public school money, give it to for-profit scams like they did in Ohio, may have caught doing so, the public schools decline. So extremism and corruption are literally the outgrowths and ultimately the drivers of gerrymandering, because in a fair democracy, the corruption wouldn't work. The poor outcomes would lead to accountability for the politicians creating those outcomes. Once you gerrymander, they know that they can have terrible schools and worse health outcomes and no infrastructure and still get reelected. Just like they know they can pass things like abortion bans, no exception to rape or incest, and get reelected. So both extremism and the corruption are sort of tied to the hip with these broken state houses. And that's why we see what we see in Ohio, a downward spiral of both corruption and extremism. And the smart ones know, they could, think of, and you've done this longer than I have. If you are a politician and you have dedicated your career to a path of extremism, out of touch with your voters, and corruption for which you could be held accountable, you have all these screwed up incentives, as in one being keep attacking democracy. Because if you ever allowed a fair democracy back into your system, back in your district, you know the candidate would beat you by pointing out how extreme you are and how corrupt you are. So once they're on this course of extremism and corruption, they really have this intense incentive to keep gerrymandering. And that's why you see these states, people think it can never get worse. They can't keep suppressing. They keep gerrymandering. They know they have to, because they would never survive in a fair democracy with records as extreme and as honestly corrupt as many of the records are.
Thank you for watching. Make sure you subscribe to our channel so you never miss a video. Also, for more content just like this, please consider joining our Warning Premium community. You can find out more in the description below.